Hey everybody, I think we're about to get started, so if you could grab your seats and get comfortable, I'll encourage you to sit closer to the front.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here for Authoritarian Journalism, a book talk with Dr. Ruth Moon. My name is Maria Desroches. I'm a graduate assistant at the Riley Center here at the Manship School. And before we get started, I just want to go over a few housekeeping notes. So first, please silence your cell phones. We do encourage tweeting, Instagramming, Snapchatting, and all other social media engagement. Secondly, we're gonna weave in some audience questions throughout this event today. So Dr. Moon will be available to sign copies of her book at the end of today's event. And if you didn't get a chance whenever you signed in, we're gonna do a raffle, giving away 10 copies of the book, so enter in the raffle. And now I'll be happy to turn it over to Dr. Janae Slocum, Director of the Riley Center.
Thanks, Maria. Maria, are you ready for an announcement? You are? Okay. So Maria is not just a graduate assistant at the Riley Center anymore. Starting Monday, she will officially be the program coordinator. Since Mariana left in the fall to go to her awesome job at another university in New Orleans, Maria has been picking up a lot of those tasks, so we're really excited to have her officially on the board. So could we give her one more round of applause? Well, welcome tonight. I'm really excited about this program. We often don't get a lot of opportunities to talk about international journalism issues and situations, and we're going to get to talk about one specific country, but a lot of what we learned and what Dr. Ruth Moon learned during her studies and her research is that you can apply a lot of the concepts that you learn in certain places to other places, but you also have to be careful that you're not trying to apply one particular context to another without questioning if those same environmental constraints are applicable in that particular place. So do you guys want to go ahead and sit down? Yes. So the book that we'll be talking about today is Authoritarian Journalism, Controlling the News in Post-Conflict Rwanda. Dr. Moon took a deep dive in the country. How many months were you there? 7 months doing ethnographic research. And she spoke with folks who are practicing, the people who are trying to influence them from outside and from inside, and was able to provide a really great perspective on what's happening there. Today we'll have Uyen Diep, who is a second-year Ph.D. student moderating for us, and we're gonna go a little bit off script today. Typically, we have the moderator do questions, and at the end, we'll have a few audience questions if we're really lucky, but we're gonna intersperse those questions from the audience throughout, so be prepared. We have a smaller crowd today, so we wanna get some more participation. So beyond this book, Dr. Moon has published in digital journalism, journalism studies, journalism, information, communication, and society, and International Journal of Communication. Did I miss? Oh, there's other outlets, so there's other outlets. And her research is informed by more than 10 years of professional journalism experience as a reporter as well. And let me tell you a little bit more about Uyen. Uyen not only is a PhD student here, but she's been a U.S. foreign correspondent in Vietnam. Are you still doing some of that work while you're here? Okay, that's what I thought. She has worked in journalism for 8 years and has worked for 4 different newspapers as a reporter. She was also a Singapore-based correspondent in 2016 and a Malaysia-based correspondent from 2017 to 2018, working on many high-profile occurrences such as the U.S. elections in 2016 and 2020, the Trump-Kim summits, the Kim Jong-nam murder case, and more. And with that, I'll turn it over to Uyen.
Right, thank you so much. So let's get into the discussions. So the first question is, what motivates you to examine journalism in Rwanda Do you have any unique connections there?
Yeah, that's a good question because it's the first question everyone always asks. So, and I also wanted to say, like Janae said, since there's a little bit of a smaller crowd, we can, I think, manage questions as we're going. So if you guys have questions and want to know more about something, or whatever, just feel free to raise your hand as we go, and someone can bring you a microphone. I think Maria can do that probably. Yeah. So feel free to jump in if you have a question, and we can just make it a conversation because I like those better than lectures anyway. So you asked why Rwanda. So I don't have any personal connections to Rwanda, but there are a couple of things that make Rwanda a really interesting place to study, and I think that give it relevance beyond just this specific country. So Rwanda is a really small country. It's got a population of 12 million people. It's landlocked. It's in East Africa. It's one of those places that you don't necessarily think a lot about, and when you do, you think of the Rwandan genocide. So it's known by a very specific single event on the global stage. So it's not necessarily the first place that would come to mind when you're thinking, where can I learn a bunch of things about journalism on a global scale? But I think Rwanda can speak to journalism in a lot of other places for a few reasons. And one of them is in Rwanda, you see this contemporary authoritarianism that's kind of taking root around the world. So it's not like the old school dictatorship where you get thrown in jail if you disagree with the ruler necessarily, but it is the kind of country where where it's very uncomfortable to express political disagreement. Mm-hmm. And that shows up in a lot of different ways, but much more subtly than in some of the older classic studies of journalism in authoritarian contexts. So this is a good place to kind of understand how that looks. And Rwanda is also fairly well known for being a country with stable governance. Since the genocide, the country has done a really good job of stabilizing and promoting security. So it's an example of a country that's successful authoritarian country in the contemporary global scene. And another way that Rwanda speaks, the Rwandan example kind of speaks to other places, is that it's a country on the periphery, which means that Rwanda doesn't have a lot of global power. And there are many, many other countries in similar situations that are not global power centers. And so understanding how journalism works in those places is really important, because most of the journalists in the world are working in these places where their country is not a power center. Journalists themselves are not necessarily particularly powerful in their social context. And then finally, sorry, I keep turning my head and it gets really loud. Rwanda is a post-conflict context, which is the main thing that if you know much about Rwanda. So that's kind of an obvious one, but that post-conflict context, I think it carries over to many, many other places on a less extreme level. But even in the US, we see this situation where journalists are treated as being responsible for creating sort of conflict due to some of the rhetoric of the last several years. And so, the way journalists the rhetoric around journalists' involvement in the genocide has a lot to do with how journalists act today. And although that specific event is a really extreme example, that carries, it has some implications for how journalists act in other places too. That was kind of a long answer. But there you go.
That's really interesting case that you chose. So what is the main point or ideas that you want to convey through your book?
So my book is based on a lot of interviews and discussions with journalists, and also observations. So I spent time in several different newsrooms in Rwanda. And I really started out by looking at how journalists, just wondering how journalists make decisions, how they decide what to cover, how they decide what's going to be news, and then, basically what happens to get the news produced in the way that it is. And I think what I found, and what I hope the book emphasizes, is that it's a really complex process. It's not just the result of laws and political structures enforcing certain ways of doing journalism, but it's also journalists themselves believing that journalism should hold a particular social role. It's also the public shared sort of social beliefs about how journalism can be harmful and has been harmful in the past. and therefore what kind of a limited role journalism should hold in society today. So, you know, the big picture argument I hope that I make in the book is that journalists in an authoritarian context are not just controlled by strict authoritarian laws. They also have a lot of their sort of rules are shaped by the journalists themselves and the social structures as well.
Yeah. So I know that you have been a journalist in the U.S. for 10 years. So do you see what is some similarities and differences between the U.S. and Rwanda in journalism practices?
Yeah. So I noticed a lot of differences that were more like of degree than like of quality. So I would say there weren't so many qualitative differences, but there was more of certain things that happened in Rwanda than in the U.S. So Rwandan journalism tended to be very event-focused and oriented, which is also a thing in U.S. journalism, but I saw it to a more extreme degree in Rwanda. I also saw sort of a focus on pack journalism, so like everyone needs to cover the same story, which again happens in the U.S. too, but I saw it really consistently happening in Rwanda. And then the last thing I saw that I've seen in some contexts in the U.S. and was even more apparent in Rwanda is a relational sort of practice of journalism. You really have to rely on relationships with your sources, your editor, you know, all kinds of relationships to get the news that you want to publish and then to produce articles or stories, because the written procedures to get information they kind of break down often. So like in the US, you might say, well, it doesn't matter if you like me, I'm going to file a FOIA. But in Rwanda, you can file FOIA and it's not going to get you anything, or it'll be 2 or 3 years before anything happens. So you really have to build relationships and consistently sort of know that people trust you in order to get information, which has a lot of sort of trickle-down effects on what you decide to publish and how you publish it and when you publish it. Yeah.
Wait. The live stream folks cannot hear you unless you're speaking into the microphone.
Okay, you had mentioned that you noticed that Rwandans were event-focused in their journalism, and of course that's the case in the United States. Do you mind explaining, as opposed to a different kind of journalism that focuses on something else more like maybe topic-based as opposed to event-based? Like, do you mind explaining that a little bit more?
Yeah, that's a good question, thanks. So in general, journalism everywhere tends to be pretty episodic, in that journalists like to focus on episodes and stories they can tell with like a plot arc rather than like themes or like, you know, policy areas or something, because those are a lot harder to tell stories about. But specifically what I mean is that I saw a lot of like press release or a lot of press conference coverage. So like it was a very sort of ritualistic approach. That's not quite the word I was looking for. There's a better word, but it was an approach to journalism that really depends on like events and ceremony. That's the word. A very like ceremony-oriented approach. Like there's a press conference happening here, all the journalists are going to go. There's a whole tent full of journalists. For instance, at this event where they were like doing a ribbon cutting for some new city buses. Like in the U.S., it's not necessarily the top news item, and you wouldn't expect all the journalists to be there. But there were probably like 100 journalists in this tent waiting to take pictures of the buses and listening to these speeches by like public officials. So it's a very like ceremonial orientation towards like what needs to be covered, or what would be covered by journalists. Yeah.
Thank you. You mentioned just a bit ago that the relationships that you have to build need to be very strongly cultivated with both the sources and the community that you're interacting with. Did you find that there's a different emotional connection level that you needed as a foreign journalist versus a domestic journalist interacting with the population in Rwanda?
I think, so I talked to some foreign correspondents, and I think the sense I got is that they could rely a little bit more on expectations, because they worked for a news outlet where they would be publishing the story regardless. So like if you're working for Reuters or the Associated Press or Agence France Presse, your article is going to go into print regardless, and so then officials wouldn't want to be that person who's like, you know, couldn't be reached for comment or something. So there's a little more pressure on them to respond and interact. So that organizational like the organizational power gave some sort of weight to those journalists. Whereas local journalists, often if you didn't get the right number of quotes, or quotes from the right number of the right people for your story, this editor would kill the story. So, the journalist needed the quotes like as much as or more than the person needed to look good in the story, if that makes sense.
Does this relate to, I know you talked about in the book that part of the kind of system of expectations about what journalists will cover and the image that's being broadcast out in the world and reported on, does that relate to kind of the piece of the power of the international organizations and the importance for officials to speak to them?
Yeah, I think so. One of the, it's a little bit outside of the scope of the book, but for my grad class last semester, I made my students read this book about how some successful authoritarian countries message their governments to the outside world. And Rwanda is a very successful image management strategy, and it has to do with this like really curating and being careful about how you're seen to outsiders. So in a story that's going into like a wire service, is going to be read by people in Germany or London, there would be some more pressure to like appear. There'd just be more pressure on appearances, I think. Yeah.
Thank you for everything. So I was wondering if, besides the ceremonial focus, right, do you have an example of a social or journalistic norm that shaped a decision or like a story you observed, maybe like an unexpected or surprising way?
Yes, let me think about it for a second. I was, well, I don't know that this is surprising necessarily, but I was definitely, I definitely noticed quickly that that to journalists in Rwanda, making the country, to many of the journalists in Rwanda, making the country, helping promote unity is a really important goal for how journalists cover things. So it meant that they tended to prioritize stories that showed people getting along and working together, and sort of demotivated or disincentivized stories about conflict, which is another sort of layer in the story of why journalists might write stories that tend to promote the government. It's not just because the government is saying don't write these stories. There's also sort of an intentional inner motivation to work that kind of angle.
Is it something related to the concept of underdevelopment that you mentioned in the book, that how it impacts the journalism practices?
Yeah, so one of the things I found that was that's actually, yeah, that's a good connection. So it's really, I noticed often that journalists tended to say that they were not, that they're not quite professional, like not professional enough, needed to be more professional, needed more professional training. If only we were more professional, we could do X, Y, Z. So this is a narrative I saw pretty frequently. And so I sort of dove into this narrative trying to understand like how it was functioning and what journalists meant by it. And what I argue in the book is that journalists, this narrative serves basically to shift responsibility for practicing journalism in a sort of, what's the word I'm looking for?
Like, do for the public good?
Yeah, practicing journalism in support of the public good, thank you.
Yeah.
The narrative tends to put all that responsibility onto the individual journalist and sort of shift it away from the system. Because the narrative is like, if we had more training, we would know what to do, we would be better at this. So it means it's the journalist's fault if something doesn't work out, or if the story doesn't come out, or if you don't get the right sources that you need to, make your editor approve of the story. It tends to be the fault of the individual journalist. And that narrative, I think, basically tends to sort of cover up or gloss over the many, many contextual challenges that journalists face, in terms of social structure, in terms of support from policy, in terms of organizational support, in terms of funding models and that kind of thing. So.
We have a question over here.
Yeah, so you mentioned earlier that majority of the journalistic questions is event-based, and then they go for events and then they get the news. But I wanted to find out, so when these journalists go for events, are they allowed to frame their stories in any way that they want in terms of bringing it out at the end of the day? That is one. And the second bit also about they getting a quote from, let's say, the politicians to sort of give some credibility to the story. Do they get a quote by, let's say, recording it, or when they are, because I've read news stories where some journalists in certain African countries would go for events, they sit down, wait, and then when they are done, they go to these authorities and say, I need a copy of your speech, and that is what they will use to basically frame the story around it. So how is that done?
Yeah. Okay. So your first question was, are they allowed to frame the story however they want? It depended on what kind of event they were covering, but specifically, one thing I remember specifically is that some journalists got in trouble with their editor for trying to put a creative angle on a story where the president, Paul Kagame, was giving a speech. And the editor was like, no, we can't do angles on this story. All you can do is go to find the recording and record literally everything he said. Just report in order everything the president said. You're not allowed to do creative angles on this story. So there's definitely a lot of expectations around how you're going to cover events, especially with high-powered politicians. And I think it varied a little bit depending on what the story was. Like a story about buses being unveiled, probably a little bit less tense. But as you go up the ladder, there's a lot of expectation, sort of rules around how you cover it. And then as far as getting quotes, I did see, I sometimes saw people waiting afterwards to talk to someone to get a quote, but I also saw people recording the speeches and then leaving afterwards, because a lot of these events last so long that the journalists had to piece out right away to write their story so they could get it in the next day's paper and meet deadline. So they would be taking notes while this was happening, while the speeches were happening. In general, something interesting about quoting practices that I noticed is that there didn't seem to be quite as much of a emphasis on direct, exact quotes as there is in the U.S. It's very important for journalists in the U.S. that you get a quote exactly right, like word for word what the person said. But I saw several cases where people would come in and sort of narrate a quote that they had heard on the street to their editor, who would type it in. And of course, for one thing, it's being sort of translated immediately from Kinyarwanda to English, so that's automatically kind of shifting the quote. But then the person would be like, well, I changed a couple words here and there to make it sort of sound better, to get a better sense of what they were probably trying to say, which I thought was an very interesting sort of difference in, that norm and practice.
Interesting.
I'm sorry, but
follow up.
So I don't know what was the experience in terms of social media play during this event? Because there are instances where people sort of live tweets, live Facebook posts as these things are happening. So for instance, if Dr. Moon said this, they say, well, Dr. Moon says these buses are going to help people, or the ambulances are going to help ameliorate the conditions of people. So were there instances in your experiences there where journalists were live tweeting or live posting as these events were going on?
I didn't see a lot of that, but also keep in mind this was 7 years ago. So I think a fair number of social media norms have changed probably. But I didn't see a lot of live tweeting to a public audience. Now, there was a lot of WhatsApp chatter that happened internal to the newsroom. So someone would be like, this is happening, I'm at this event, this is happening, here's a quote that someone said, here's a photo. But it's more of sharing internally for the editors to use.
Good afternoon, Dr. Moon. I have a question regarding the process. How did you get to do what you did for 7 months in Rwanda? And secondly, my other question is, to what extent does censorship exist? Because your title, Authoritarian Journalism, might make some think about censorship. So to what extent does censorship exist? And what are the repercussions or ramifications of someone who reports counter to, say, the predominant occurrences or political people in power and so forth?
Good questions, thanks, Jinx. Okay, so how did I get to do what I did? There was a lot of serendipity in the process, as I think there always is in, qualitative interview, fieldwork-based research, and honestly, any successful research project, I think, has like there's a lot of luck that goes along with it. But I started out by doing a lot of paperwork, starting with the IRB process at my university and then getting an affiliation at a university in Rwanda, realizing the person I had affiliated with was actually left the university unexpectedly without telling me, so I had to get a new affiliation at the last minute. I showed up in Rwanda and needed to get clearance from the Ministry of Education, a process that can take months and months and months, but I needed it to happen fast, so I camped out outside of his office for every day for like a week until he got, I think, annoyed with me and just decided to stamp it through. Some sort of persistence and shifting who I was going to work with. And then I relied a lot on connections and people to, my research collaborator in Rwanda relied on her to connect me to people to start talking to. And my approach in general was kind of a snowball sample approach and also a top-down approach to recruitment, because that was the best and really the only way I think I could have done research in Rwanda, because it's a very hierarchical society. It's very, it is a very monitored society, so you can't just sort of go in and start talking to people on the street the way you could in like Uganda, for instance, where I could go and do interviews for months and no one would really know, no one would get in trouble, and also nobody would notice that I didn't have research clearance. But in Rwanda, people notice right away what's happening. So I started with the top down, with getting approval from the people who were in charge, and then sort of trickling down into the newsrooms to ask, to talk to people and observe what was happening, and then asking for connections to other places. And my sample is primarily people aligned, working for news publications that are relatively government aligned. So there are some more critical journalists, or maybe perhaps independent is a good word, journalists in Rwanda, but they have a very, precarious existence, I would say. And when I started trying to talk to those people, I ran into problems really quickly. So as a result, most of my research is focused on those more established and more government-aligned organizations. And so that kind of bleeds into your question about censorship. In Rwanda, there's not a lot of overt censorship in the sense of like a censor who would come to your door like there used to be in Mexico and like blackline things that you couldn't say. And part of the reason is, people told me, the reason is because you don't need it. You don't need censorship when there are so many different sort of mechanisms to make people concerned about writing the wrong thing, and they self-censor. So there's enough sort of different cross-cutting currents. There's not a lot of political support for journalists. There's not a lot of social support for journalists, and there's also not a lot of there's not a lot of money in journalism, so there aren't a lot of competing businesses. It can be easy to lose funding as a news organization. So with all of these different pressures, the thing that makes sense to do often is to write news that's not going to rock the boat. And that's because you want to keep your job, and you want to stay in the country, and you want to, you want your family to be able to keep their jobs. There's a lot of different reasons why that choice would make sense.
Right. Since you're sharing about your time in Rwanda, can you share with us one of your memorable events when collecting data there?
Yeah, so a lot of the things that happened to me in Rwanda, I would say, led to really interesting observations, or the things I remember were things that made it into the book somehow, or turn into articles that I worked on. So one of the things that stood out to me really quickly, and like a specific memory I have, is getting stuck in the rain when I was trying to get somewhere, because a lot of the transportation in Rwanda happens by motorcycle taxi. And it's the easy way to go, it's the cheapest way to go, it just makes a lot of sense. But when you're on a motorcycle taxi and a lot of the roads are dirt and pretty steep, and the rain is like monsoon rain, like in Louisiana, you don't necessarily, your taxi driver will often like stop and just make you wait out the rain when you're on your way somewhere. So you can't count on being able to get somewhere really quickly and like on time necessarily, especially during the rainy season. And so that had like pretty far-reaching implications for how journalism practice worked. And you know, my experience actually getting stuck in the rain and having to sit under the awning of a store for like 30 minutes while I waited for it to stop helped me think about what that might do to journalists. And then another experience I had was when I started reaching out to these journalists who were doing a little bit more critical or independent work. Like I said, I very quickly started running into some challenges, but I remember the first person I met with, he picked me up, he said he was gonna take me to his newsroom, but he was pretty concerned that he was being followed, so we kind of did a bunch of like loops and like circles, and he took me to his newsroom, and it was like pretty late at night, and it all had this very like sort of sketchy feeling, you know, like, and I was like, this guy's he's got to be paranoid. Like, I don't think this is probably warranted. Like, why is he doing this? And then the next day, I got a call from the immigration office saying that my visa had been denied. So it was like less than 24 hours later. So that was one of the experiences that helped me understand and sort of put me in the mindset of why, like, what I had thought was paranoia actually makes sense in the context of this culture where someone's always watching you. Like, it really is, like, I think pretty true. There's a lot of research to support that, like, there's this monitorial culture where, like, you don't know who's looking, who's reporting on you, who's turning, you know, who's taking notes. So that experiencing that myself made me really understand it in a way that just hearing people talk about it didn't really drive home.
Did you have to leave the country in under 24 hours?
I had 36 hours, I think, but it was fast. Yeah.
You had to wait on the plane?
Yep.
You have the question.
That was my question. Did you have to leave?
He has a question.
Yeah.
Wait.
So my question comes from, we read a book from Media Law class from Dr. Mari, where we spoke about hate speech. Hi, Dr. Mari. Where we spoke about hate speech, Carlson basically. And in his book, he chronicles issues such as news that happens in Rwanda, in countries in Asia, in America, and the reasons they are behind that. And one of the key things or contexts that he brought into being was the historical evolutions and how that has impacted the sort of news that they practice. Now, you mentioned the fact that from the title, Controlling the News in Post-Conflict Rwanda, considering the whole political history of the Tutsis and the Hutus and everything that happened, do you think that has been a key factor in sort of shaping the level of news that they allow? Because maybe they feel like they are treading on a very sharp, span, and so they don't want to be too free or independent where it could lead them back into where they were? Or do you think it's just a matter of they being paranoid, as you put it in your earlier question?
No, you actually just summarized one of my talking points really effectively, so thank you. That's a huge factor, I think, is real concern that, like, this might happen again. We journalists were responsible for part of, for like promoting these hate, like messages of hate and like stirring up like contention, and we don't want to do that again. And so we're going to be really careful about what we publish and how we publish it. So it's not just that there are laws about hate speech that are pretty wide and broad and not and sort of hard to interpret. But there's personal investment in not wanting to push journalism into supporting this kind of thing again. That I think is really a really powerful motivator. And it's also really interesting to me because it's a social myth, and I use the word myth not to say that it's not true, but that it's really powerfully motivating, even though there actually is not a lot of research to support the fact that journalists were so powerful in the genocide. But it's such a pervasive story that it I think has a huge influence on how journalists work today. Yeah.
Can you speak to a little bit of how your interactions with journalists in Rwanda may have changed how you approach and write journalism here in the U.S.?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think I left field work and this whole project much more aware of why journalists might do things differently in different places. Much less, I hope, attached to a certain way of doing things that's very grounded in America and our laws and protections and rules and history. And there's just a lot of sort of a lot more context going on in other places. And I guess in general, more contextually aware, I think. Like any sort of trip to another culture or experience of another community, you know, the more you can experience of it, the more you're aware that like your context matters so much in how you do things and why you do things. Yeah.
Yeah, that's why I love one of the arguments in your books, like you say the journalists can exercise their autonomy even in an unfree environment. So can you elaborate more about that?
Yeah, let me see if I can find my notes about this.
Let me see which question's number is it.
So I think that, you know, one of the things I'm really interested in, and you have another question on what I want to study next. So one of the things I'm really interested in out of this project and continuing is kind of understanding how journalists act, what choices they make within the space that they have to make decisions. So in Rwanda, the space for journalism is kind of narrower, I would say, than it is in the US. Journalists have less power. They have less social power, they have less political power, they just don't have as much power. But they still have the ability, you know, they're still thinking and making decisions about how they want to approach things and how they want to cover stories. And it's shaped by history, it's shaped by their own understanding of events and sort of what's important. And so I think I'm really interested in exploring more about how journalists make these decisions and what shapes sort of what factors beyond like politics and policy shape how they choose to act in those spaces. So one of the things I noticed in my study, so I mostly was in Rwanda, but I also traveled to Uganda and Tanzania and Zimbabwe, and I saw some different ways that journalists engage with politics and sort of push and navigate policy to produce certain kinds of stories, like different ways that they can negotiate sort of their policy environments. So I think it's fascinating that you know, journalism is obviously not monolithic, and even within a community, like different journalists have different ways of approaching things.
Yeah. So I wonder that under that strict environment, is there any challenges or difficulties that journalists need to overcome to like report objectively and like report the facts, telling the truth?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that I mean, there's a lot of relational challenges, I think, in the context of Rwanda, because it's a small country and relationships are very important for a lot of reasons. So the relational challenges become, relationships become very powerful in that context, and I think that can make it harder sometimes to report on particular stories. And I've seen this even in rural communities in the US, so it's definitely not a phenomenon unique to Rwanda. You know, the smaller your community is, the more you know each other, the more you feel invested in the community, the harder it can be to do what you might think of as your job as a journalist, to report the stories that are going to make people uncomfortable, to, you know, name people in positions of power who are abusing that power for some reason. It just becomes much more challenging the more you know the people you're talking about. And so that's one big challenge.
Any questions from the audience?
Sorry. Okay, so in terms of the methodology that you employed, mostly in terms of interviews and looking at them, do you think if you you interviewed someone who was outside of Rwanda, maybe a Rwandan who wasn't in Rwanda, like as a journalist, but was outside of Rwanda, like let's say in the States or in Britain, do you think the person would have, the sort of response the person provided to you, do you think would have been the same or would have been different? And in addition, coming from a Western society like the United States of America and going there with the lens that you might have had, having an independent, free press and blah, 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 how do you think that shaped your storytelling in the book in terms of facing a kind of journalism in Rwanda that is totally different?
So as far as interviewing journalists outside of Rwanda, I've actually done some of that. It's not in the book, but I have done some of that. And Rwanda is one country where people have very similar opinions. So outside as they do in the country, or at least they talk similarly, and I think it's partly because the surveillance state, the Rwandan surveillance state, is really powerful, so you don't escape it when you leave. So so journalists who are in, you know, the US still are, they know, or they say that there are people sort of watching, keeping tabs on them. You know, they're still equally as cautious about what they say here as they are in Rwanda. And that is a function of the particular surveillance state of Rwanda. So it's not something that might apply everywhere, but is definitely sort of a broad arm. And then in terms of my own storytelling, certainly, yes, my own context, like my background as an American journalist had a lot to do with shaping what I thought I was going to find or how I sort of approached the field. I spend a fair amount of time in the book talking about my own positionality and how that might have influenced what I saw and what kinds of things I did to avoid that or at least to be aware of that, because I think as an ethnographer you can't really be objective, but you can be aware of your own limitations and your own perspective, and you can you can sort of keep that front of mind as you're writing. So one of the things I did is sort of started tweaking my interview questions early on, because my initial interview questionnaire asked things that I realized didn't make sense in the Rwandan context, or people were answering it differently from what I expected. And so a lot of I ended up cutting out a lot of buzzwords. So freedom, initially I was asking questions about freedom of the press and liberty and that kind of thing, and it just wasn't, people weren't answering, the answers weren't making sense, and they weren't even getting at what I wanted anyways. So I just started cutting out these buzzwords and instead started asking about things I observed. So I saw you do this thing, or I saw you, with the quotes, I saw you translating quotes in your head and then telling the editor, can you tell me why you did that, what that means? Can you tell me when you decide not to publish a story, what's the process? How did, who tells you not to write it? How does it not, where does it get cut? At what point in the process does that happen? That kind of thing. So the more I asked process-oriented questions, the better, the more I felt like I was getting a really good sense of what was happening and not just talking about buzzwords that mean different things in different contexts.
That's true.
Hi. I first just wanted to commend you for this book. It's just such a stellar piece of scholarship. And I also wanted to commend the Riley Center for supporting this work. Oh, and Wynn also likes it. This is my son. He's also a big fan. Because I think this is such such a great example of the collaboration between the Riley Center and the Manship School, and how it produces just excellent research and scholarship. So I wanted to say that, but I also wanted to ask, I can't recall if it's in the book or if we had this conversation, but I remember you noting that one of the effects of all these different norms is that coverage in Rwanda is way more positive than we might see, for example, in sort of other more typical contexts. And as you know, and most people in this audience know, one of the sort of values of news is typically a focus on the negative. There's also behavioral evolutionary reasons that we focus on the negative. So can you kind of speak to what the effect of that might be in an information environment like Rwanda? And I don't know if your work speaks directly to this, or if you know of work, or if you want to speculate wildly. I would welcome all of it.
I could speculate wildly. I think that, well, what it doesn't do is make the problems go away, obviously. So it means that journalists talked about themselves as doing PR, for instance. Like several different journalists were like, oh, we're not really doing journalism, we're doing PR. So even the journalists in Rwanda who are focusing on fairly positive news often said, this is not really journalism. Now, other people said, oh, we're doing development journalism. Like, not all of them were like, oh, positive is just outside of our outside of the norm. But I do think that when there's an overwhelming emphasis on positive, it ends up just sort of shoving problems under the table, and you lose the ability to hold leaders accountable. And that's really, I think, critical, whether or not you have a really strong single leader in power or a broadly democratic government. Like, holding people accountable is, I think, crucial. And so when you're covering positive news exclusively or even mostly, you're losing the ability to say like, hey, we're seeing this thing that's concerning. Can we dig a little bit more into this? And another thing I think interpersonally that is challenging is some of these rules, the rules and regulations, and even the sort of social approach to emphasizing the positive has to do with the genocide. So there's a lot of desire to not go back to the genocide, to not create to not enter this conflict again. And therefore, to emphasize the fact that we are all Rwandan, we all get along, we have moved past the genocide, the ethnic conflict that started the genocide. But there's a lot of research that shows that that's not actually gone. Like that ethnic conflict and tension is still there. It's just kind of under the surface. And that can be dangerous, just as dangerous as surfacing it in coverage. So that's outside of my area, but I think that the danger in like covering things up and pretending it's all good is that eventually it explodes.
So you already mentioned about your future plan, but just a bit of that. So I just want to ask, what is your future plan? Do you plan to examine other journalism contexts in authoritarian countries or deep dive into aspect of Rwanda?
Yeah. Well, I'm interested in studying, I think, authoritarianism in other contexts. One thing I'm especially interested in right now is a shift towards like authoritarian practice theory, which looks at not so much the distinction between like, is a country authoritarian or is it democratic, but to what extent are certain practices encouraging more transparency or less transparency in a certain country, and that journalism obviously there are a lot of ways that journalism could be implicated in both of those things, more and less transparency. So that's what I'm interested in looking at, sort of moving towards, is like how journalism, what practices journalists engage in that can promote transparency or that can alternatively help leaders make decisions without people knowing what's happening.
Any questions from the audience? I continue. So I'm aware that the book is actually part of your dissertation. So do you have any advice for graduate students to like have a book like yours or to have a meaningful for their final project?
Yes, I wrote some advice for you guys. Okay, so there are a couple of things I would say. One is the first thing you need to do is like be an expert as much as you can on your topic before you start doing your research. So the more you know ahead of time, the more you can kind of guide your project and set yourself up for success. So that kind of goes without saying, but it was like the first thing that my committee told me when I was working on this, and it's just really important. And so, I was not as much of an expert as I could have been before I went, but everything I knew helped me interpret what was happening. And then a lot of the rest of my advice kind of has to do with the fact that research is a very messy process, and it doesn't go in like the ABCD or like 1, 2, 3 process that you learn about in methods classes. There's a lot of like sort of circles and like backtracks and like dead ends, and so being flexible through the process and being aware of what you're trying to do is super important. So like for me that meant I did some data processing what in parallel with collection, like while I was in the field. I was there for 2 months, and I started noticing some themes in my interviews, and I wrote a paper that I sent to AAJMC that turned into a book chapter and also into one of the articles I wrote. And that helped me sort of think about how I was going to do the rest of the project. And then I also had to sort of pivot a lot as I was collecting data. So being flexible in like where I was going to collect data, who I was meeting with, when I was meeting, that kind of thing. And then also like bigger picture, what kinds of questions I could answer. Like once I started realizing I could talk easily to certain kinds of journalists, the ones who worked for the sort of state-oriented, more pro-government outlets, and could not easily talk to the more independent journalists, that sort of changed what I could find. So, what kinds of questions could I answer based on who I was able to access? So flexibility, know your subject really thoroughly before you start, and then be thoughtful through the process about what you're finding and how that might shape what you need to do next. Those are my tips, I would say.
Would you talk a little bit about how there are differences in how folks approach research depending on kind of the discipline, and when I ask this, it's more that certain types of IRBs, for example, seem very rigid. I came from a more kind of sociology background, and as I got into my own field work, I was really doing more ethnography. And so I wanted to ask this question of like, what's your advice on how you like frame your IRB so that you are actually covering what you're doing as you're adjusting things in the field?
Yeah. That is a good question. Well, for one thing, I filed some amendments, especially as I got documents translated. I filed a bunch of amendments. But I also would say my advisor's advice to me that was really useful was write as broad of an IRB as you possibly can. So like all the questions you think you might possibly want to answer, put them in there. Everything that you might possibly want to observe, do you want to look at the color of people's clothes, put it in there. And then also, I've at least found at LSU's IRB, they're accommodating to the fact that research, that qualitative research needs to be flexible and can't use like a questionnaire that's word for word the same for everybody. So they can accommodate that, and they know that like you're going to shift a little bit as you go along. But I think the advice that I got that like served me really well was like write as broad of an application as you possibly can, and then take it from there.
You noted that you were in country for about 7 months. How did you afford all of this? And can you speak to, for grad students specifically, how we can look for funding to kind of get these opportunities?
Yeah, it was, I spent a long time applying for grants. So I applied for all the big ones like the Fulbright. I don't know, that's the only big one I remember. But there are a lot of big ones that I applied for and didn't get. I ended up getting a fellowship from an organization called the Boren something, and they do undergrad awards and also Ph.D. awards. It has a lot of restrictions. It's only for American citizens, and you have to add some language learning component onto it. But that was the one that worked out for me. And it was kind of a weird last minute, like, oh, I guess I'll try this. It doesn't seem like a great fit, but I'll apply for it. So that's one thing is I would say like apply for all the stuff, even if it seems like it might not be a great fit. It's hard to know what committees are looking for. And then that was the big one I got, but I also pieced together a lot of funding from different places. So like someone gave me $500, some center on campus. And then another center on campus, like the Center for Labor Studies, gave me $2,500. The African Studies Center, was the one that gave me $500. My own department had a little bit of funding that, also added up. So looking for little pots of money was pretty helpful in getting me like up to where I needed to be. But also I would say, research, fieldwork is expensive, but fieldwork in Rwanda or Uganda or Tanzania is not as expensive as, for instance, fieldwork in Paris would be. So, I was surprised by how far my money stretched once I got the expensive plane ticket and like got over there. That's something to keep in mind too in budgeting. And I'm also always like happy to talk to you guys if you want to do fieldwork research and apply for grants. Like I've done a lot of budgets, especially, and just a lot of applications. So happy to give advice.
How much time did you spend on a weekly basis on your grant applications during grad school?
I've like blocked that from my memory, but it was probably at least half a day every week for like the semester. A solid semester, and then probably into the next semester too. So, and I was still stressing out about it and like doing research and adding things to my list until I found out I got one of them, and then I like relaxed a little bit. So.
You can also look at universities that have more. They have more folks who are doing international research, and they're going to have other lists of resources that you might not see at LSU.
I will ask my final questions. So do you think that, I wonder with the availability and accessibility of digital technology, what do you think about the importance of the fieldwork, like you physically being there and research?
Yeah, that's a great question. So like one of the things I love about digital technology is that it lets us access communities who we might not have been able to connect with otherwise. So like if you don't have the money to do fieldwork, you could still do interviews with I could still have done interviews with, journalists in Rwanda, potentially, theoretically. Now, and that's awesome. And in some ways it makes some parts of the research process cheaper, and it makes access easier, or at least seem like it will be easier. But for me, at least, I found that access came with being there in person. So I had a lot of doors open up to me once I was standing in front of somebody that were not there, that were closed before I got to Rwanda. So that access was a huge part of being there in person. And now that I've gotten connections, I can do interviews on Zoom with people because they know who I am. They sort of trust me. We've had conversations before, but the initial phase, I think, would have been really challenging to do on Zoom. And the other thing is that a lot of the things I learned while I was there came from these like serendipitous encounters, like getting stuck in the rain, and meeting this guy who took me to his like sort of backwoods office newsroom. Like these things wouldn't have happened if I had been just conducting research on Zoom. And not only did they like give me actual encounters and experiences to write about, but they also gave me like sort of a sense of what it's like to live in this place and to be a journalist or even just a person in this country. So that sort of context then shapes how I write and what I how I interpret what I experience, and I hope gives me more, makes it better, because I just have more cultural awareness and contextual awareness of what happened. So there are some really cool things about digital technology, but I think they can't replace like being there, looking at someone, over coffee or whatever, and taking a moto taxi to get to where they are going to meet you, that kind of thing.
That makes sense.
Any questions?
Last questions?
No more questions? All right, we got two more.
You're done.
2 questions.
You mentioned more independent journalists. How are they funded, the more critical journalists?
That's a very good question. I think it's a combination of they're super precarious, so their funding goes in and out and in and out. So sometimes they'll be working and sometimes they won't. Some donors from other countries, I think, fund these people. And by donors, I mean like it might be a person who sends money on Venmo, that kind of thing. And some advertisements, but not a lot, because a lot of the advertisement funding, like the more official sources of funding, go to organizations that are more producing more socially acceptable news, I would say. Yeah, so it's very financially precarious to be a independent journalist.
Did you at any point feel like your life was in danger? Based on, you initially gave a story of how one journalist was like winding his ways before finally getting to his office. So do you ever feel like your life was in danger, having like experienced such a thing, going on a number of times? And then secondly, as an American, did you feel like there were embassies, like diplomats or like American embassy, blah, blah, blah embassies, who sort of maybe played any key role in or sort of like advocating for more independent journalists, freedom of the press in that regard? And do you think that plays any role, like international organizations and so on and so forth?
Yeah, okay. So did I feel like my life was in danger? No, but I'm notoriously oblivious. You can ask Will. I like never could tell you if someone was following me around. So that might be just a function of me and not that I was actually super safe all the time. But nothing happened to me, I can say that. And then in terms of, well, and I guess I should also say Rwanda is like a very safe country. So like chances of you getting like mugged on the street are like really low. So in terms of that kind of physical safety also, it's a place where I felt like I could walk down the street at night after dark and go to the bar down the, on the corner, and I would be safe, which I think is not the case for the surrounding countries in East Africa. And not even necessarily the case in Baton Rouge. So there's that. And then in terms of like international assistance and like how that helps journalists, honestly, I think I'm still kind of working on this argument, but like I think it helps more than, or I think it hurts more than it helps. Because I think it contributes to this mindset that if we just give journalists more training, they'll be able to do their job as if they were in the US. And that's not true. Yeah. Like no matter how much training you give journalists in Rwanda, they're still journalists, Rwandan journalists in Rwanda with different social contexts, with this shared story of how the genocide has influenced society and how journalists were active in the genocide and how important it is to keep the peace and to like get along. And that's just different from the US. No matter how many like tools and strategies journalists have to file FOIAs and to like do fancy videos and to like ask lots of good interview questions, they're not going to, that's not going to change like the culture. And it's also, but it does give them an excuse for just continuing with the kind of journalism they've been doing. Whereas I think the best case would be for journalists in Rwanda and in a lot of other countries to start to rethink what good journalism should be. Not how do we look more like journalism in the US, but how do we produce journalism that's good for our context, that holds people accountable in the context of Rwanda, where that looks different from, US democracy and US politics. So I think because there's a lot of Western countries pumping aid into these journalism and media assistance programs, it keeps the focus on like the gap between looking like the US and looking like local journalism. And I think shifting to think about how we change local journalism to be the most useful for its context is really important and not really happening right now.
Interesting. All right. Any more questions? We take maybe one more. Okay. Well, thank you, Ian, for moderating today. Thank you, Dr. Moon, for sharing your experience in doing your research and in writing this book. I enjoyed learning more about your process. And all of you, thank you for being here today. The mission of the Riley Center is to talk about contemporary media and public affairs issues, where we go, I should know this, advance diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also enable civic engagement and leadership. And again, I don't think we talk about international context enough here at LSU, and I always love when we have an opportunity to do that. So can we give a round of applause to our... And then I always love to emphasize this, that the Riley Center only has 2 full-time staff. We were down 1 full-time staff for 6 months until Monday. And so it's a place that's run by graduate assistants and interns who never forget their students and their learning. So please, let's give them a round of applause for planning this. And if you'd like to see any element of this again, and those of you live streaming, you can also find this on our Manship School YouTube channel, and you can find a link to that on our Riley Center website. And while we didn't want you leaving your phone on, we do encourage you to follow us on all of our social channels. If there's anything that you found interesting, don't hesitate to comment on it and share it with all of your friends and your colleagues. The next event that we have coming up is the 2024 John Bros Symposium on AI in our industries. This is being planned in a really interesting way, very different than some of our other Bros Symposiums. It's being planned by a committee rather than mostly one faculty person. And we'll be talking about using AI in teaching and in practice in all of our area concentrations, essentially. And we're also running, excuse me, I'm getting over a cold. We're also running an experiment with our staff. So we've divided our staff into 2 groups. One is using AI to plan the events, and the other is using kind of our traditional methods, and they're journaling about it. And we've already made some very interesting discoveries in the last couple of weeks. So we encourage you to come, and that is going to be on Tuesday, April 16th, here in the Holiday Forum. And you can learn more about that on our website and on Facebook as well. In the next few days, you're going to receive an email with a survey, and we encourage you to fill that out to let us know what you thought of this event and other events and things and topics that you would be interested in hearing about here at the Manship School. Oh, and now we're going to do the raffle. I know everybody wants a free book.
Okay, so I'm just going to pull in there.
And Dr. Moon, these were not cheap books.
Delwar. I didn't do that on purpose, I promise. Delwar is amazing.
Your books like at the back table.
And don't forget, Dr. Moon will sign your copy.
John B. Me? When? Joshua J. What does that say? Oh. Morgan, Bad Rock. How many did I keep going? Okay.
I think you're on 10, 3, 4, 5, 6, this is 7.
Okay, I'm gonna pull out 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay. Lauren, L. Jinx, who's gone? I'll put in her, we can put it in her box, right? Or should I just pull another one?
Just
Whatever.
pull another one.
Okay, 2. Emily. And one more. Sohail. Sweet.
All right, once again, thank you everyone for being here. If you want to get your book signed, don't run away until you get that opportunity. Thanks, everyone.
Your share was really insightful.
Thanks.
Yeah, and